Hello, my name is Robert Coutts. I'm the chief editor of the journal Prairie History. We are marking the release of our third issue of the journal by interviewing some of the authors from the new issue about their articles. Today I'm joined by Dr. Chris Adams, who is currently the rector of St. Paul's College at the University of Manitoba. Chris has held senior positions in the public opinion research industry with different Canadian polling and research companies. He has authored a book on Manitoba politics, as well as co-edited a book on the Métis in Canada. Now, I was just going to add, Chris, that you have a new honor that I learned from Facebook. So maybe you could mention that to us.
Well, thanks, Bob. Actually, two recent things. I'm now the chair of the J.W. Defoe Foundation Board of Directors, and we give an annual national prize for a book award that's a significant contribution to our understanding of Canada and the world. The other thing that's been recent that I've been very honored to, be elected to the World Association of Public Opinion Research as the Canadian National Representative. So that officially starts January 1st, 2021.
Well, congratulations on that. That's terrific. Yeah. Welcome to this, our Zoom interviews. So I'm hoping you'll summarize the research and the engagement of people in the 2016 Manitoba election and the role of the MMF in that election and the organization of Métis candidates, or the nomination of Métis candidates. But so I'd like you to talk about that a little bit. If we could also have a little quick discussion maybe at the end about, and you and I have talked about this before, about where polling is in the 21st century, and especially in 2020. And I'm thinking the American election, but of course in provincial elections and federal elections and that sort of thing. But if you want to talk a little bit about the article first, and then we can maybe get into that discussion.
Sure. Well, thanks, Bob. And I really appreciate both your work as the editor and Gordon Goldsborough's work overseeing a lot of the work being done at the Manitoba Historical Society. So I'm glad to be a member of the society, and I hope in future years continue this relationship with this great organization. The fact of being in Prairie History, which now encompasses the full prairies instead of just Manitoba, is a great thing. And the new issue looks just fantastic with articles about Saskatchewan and other part of the prairies, not just Manitoba. But my piece really has three key components. One component, which it starts off with, is looking at the polling data. That is, when I was with Probe Research, with Scott Mackay, we launched a project called Indigenous Voices, where we surveyed Manitobans and we asked them, are you a person who's Aboriginal? And if so, how would you classify yourself within that population? So over a number of years, Probe Research has been able to pull out a segment of the population based on that question. It's the only polling data in all of Canada that captures Aboriginal Manitobans, people in the Indigenous population, and then is able to segment them out by Métis and non-Métis Indigenous peoples. So I took advantage of that relationship that I continued to have with Probe Research, and they allowed me to run the data that allowed me to analyze the extent to which Métis voters or citizens have a connection to the electoral system. And that was leading up to the 2016 provincial election. There wasn't enough data for the pre-election period, but the year prior to that, there had been enough waves of survey data collected where we were able to get a fairly substantial database together. So when I was writing this article, I thought, well, it'd be a good thing to write a piece that has that rarely seen data where we asked Métis people, would they be likely to vote in an election? And if they were voting, which party were they more connected to? So that was what I thought would be one of the contributions of this piece to the Prairie History magazine. So in the article, you can see how they shape their partisanship towards different parties and their propensity to vote. So that was the first component of the article. And I look at the secondary literature, and I'd written on this topic before with Lolene Birdall out at the University of Saskatchewan on Indigenous voting, not just Métis, but Indigenous voting. And much of the literature that I explore in this article, the secondary literature, talks about most of the studies done in Canada about Indigenous voters is focused on reserve voting, which really doesn't count the Métis. Métis people, as you know, don't live on reserves. They live, in Winnipeg, Brandon, Saint Laurent, all over the province in non-reserve communities. Mostly, there are a few that are the exception. So the secondary literature that I talk about in this article shows that most of the Canadian research on Indigenous voters has been focused on the on-reserve populations, which misses much of the Métis population. And the reason why on-reserve populations have been the focus is it's easy to look at those numbers. You can look at the polling stations, of how the party breakouts were and the percentage of the electorate in certain First Nations communities that did turn out. So you could look at Peguis and say, what was the percentage of people in the Peguis area that turned out to vote and who did they vote for? Not person by person, but the community generally, who did they vote for? You can't do that with the Métis community because you look at a polling station where Métis voters are located and you have other people in the voting population there. So I've explored that in the literature, in this article, and then I looked at the polling data where we actually do ask people who self-identify as Métis, would they be willing to vote if an election were held today, and who would they vote for? So I think that's one of the contributions to the general Canadian literature that we have in this Prairie History article. The second component deals with Métis candidates, that is the 2016 election. To what extent did we see the Métis candidates, as well as Indigenous candidates more broadly, people of the First Nations community, I show that in the article as well, what was happening in the 2016 election in terms of the percentage of candidates for each party, were they running for office, and the percentage that got elected. So we found or I found in this article when I ran the numbers, and I by identifying who is Métis and who is First Nations and who weren't First Nations or Métis candidates, I went to every candidate who ran. I went onto the websites of each of the parties. I went through the media and I identified each candidate and determined whether that person was a self-identified Métis person or a First Nations person in terms of non-Métis, but part of the First Nations communities in Manitoba. So that was a bit of legwork to do that. There were some places where I couldn't find out where the person was, so I had to either contact the person direct, the candidate, or through other avenues. So as a result, I had a profile of all the candidates who ran for the Liberals, the Progressive Conservatives, and the NDP, and the Green Party for all of the 57 constituencies in which they ran. So I provide a profile in this article showing 2016, the extent to which we saw Métis candidates. The second thing is, and you'll remember this, Bob, that the question was, I started to link this up to the question of, well, were they winning in winnable ridings? It's one thing to be a candidate for a party. It's another thing, are you being thrown into ridings or constituencies that you don't have a chance of winning? The literature on women candidates was fairly useful to me because we do know the thesis of people like Sylvia Bashevkin and others some years ago when they were writing about women candidates in Canadian politics. There was the problem in the 70s and the 80s. In many ways, many of the women candidates were what we call sacrificial lambs. That is, they were just put into ridings where they had no chance of winning. So I in some extensive endnotes, I talk about the literature and I tie in the gender question of politics and candidates, and I tie that into, is that the same thing with Métis and First Nations candidates? Were they sacrificial lambs in the 2016 election, or were they actually put into winnable ridings? One of the problems of definition is, what is a winnable riding? And there isn't really a set definition, except if you put your hat in the ring, do you think that you might have a chance of winning that riding? We know, for instance, in some ridings in Manitoba, for instance, if you were running in rural southern Manitoba and you're NDP candidate, you're probably not going to win that riding. It didn't have a track record the past number of years, and it's not a likely riding. If you are a Liberal candidate running in Transcona, it's not really deemed a winnable riding unless Sharon Carstairs is your leader. But so what I did is I looked at all the ridings these candidates ran in, the Métis candidates, and I determined that the Métis were running in many places in winnable ridings. Even if they didn't win the constituency, they were running in ridings that they either from the last election or the election in which they were running for nomination, it looked like they had a chance. And the threshold that I put it at was 25%. Did that constituency either have 25% support in the last election for that party in which the Métis candidate was running in, or did that constituency in which she or he was running in for the 2016 election, did it in the end win at least 25%? So that was my threshold. I created that threshold because there's no set threshold in the literature. So as a result, I did show in this article that the Métis people, Métis candidates for the Progressive Conservatives and the NDP were nominated in many cases in winnable ridings. And I think that's a real sign of progress among our main political parties of the Métis people have been recognized as part of the party organization. The Liberals, mostly because the Liberals don't do well in most of the province, it's hard to talk about the winnable ridings for the Liberals, but for the two main the strongest two parties in Manitoba's politics, the NDP and the Progressive Conservatives, there have been advances. One of the things, though, is traditionally speaking, the NDP has been more open to Aboriginal candidates compared to the NDP, in part because the NDP has represented more lower income parts of the city, as well as northern parts of Manitoba, where there are more Indigenous candidates that would be likely nominated. But I think for the Progressive Conservatives, they've caught up in many ways to the NDP, and that's a good sign for our provincial democracy. So that was the second component. The first component of the article dealt with polling and individual Métis people who were part of the electorate. The second thing was on the candidates. And the third part of the article deals with the role of the Manitoba Métis Federation, the MMF. And I've written on this before for our co-edited book called Métis in Canada that I co-wrote with Greg Dahl and Ian Peach for the University of Alberta Press. And it's a book that's done very well out there, a collected series of essays, Métis in Canada. And there's an article I did, a chapter I did in our book on the politics of Métis organizations in different parts of Canada. So I took some of the themes from that chapter and I put it into this Prairie History chapter to say, to see what was the role of the MMF, the Manitoba Métis Federation, which, as you know, is seen as the main organization representing Manitoba people in Manitoba. And they're recognized, generally speaking, by the media, by the government, and by academics as that's the main organization. So I looked at the MMF and I looked at what was their role in the 2016 general election of Manitoba. And I went through the MMF tweets of 2016. I interviewed a number of people that were involved with the MMF at the time, including people like Al Benoit, as well as a person who was their communications director. And I interviewed them to see what was the role of the MMF during the 2016 campaign. Now, in a nutshell, what it was the MMF really campaigned for getting out the vote, for endorsing candidates who are MMF members, that is, people who had a current membership card, citizenship card with the MMF. Where they missed out on a couple of candidates, I was a bit surprised for people like Kevin Chief, who's a recognized member of the Métis community who does a fair amount of stuff in media, Métis dancing and things like that. He was also a prominent MLA who then moved off to the Business Council of Manitoba. So there were some candidates who are missing, and it could be that they just let their membership lapse. But I did talk about the MMF and how President David Chartrand was fairly close to all three parties. But there's a picture in there, and you'll remember this, Bob, that we were looking at what pictures to include. And one of the pictures was a picture of Brian Pallister with his arm around David Chartrand. And that was prior to or right around the 2000, might have been even the day after. But we do know that Premier Pallister, or then PC leader Pallister, he wasn't the premier yet until the election occurred, but the PCs were very strongly courting the Métis vote and the Métis leadership. But when the election occurred, when Brian Pallister won his first election, there was quite a bit of fanfare, and the Métis sent out congratulatory notes. Things turned quickly problematic for the Métis, and I talk a little bit about that near the end of the article. That David Chartrand, who we know is very quick to react to news stories and things like that, where he thinks that the MMF hasn't gotten their due, and he was quick to react. And there's a little bit of a thing at the end of the article, but really I don't get into how the MMF really became distant from the progressive conservative government over the issue of hydro, land treaty rights and things like that. That's a story maybe to be told in a couple of years, and the next time I'm in Prairie History. But anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your short question, Bob, but that captures the three components, I think, of the piece in Prairie History.
Can I ask you just a little bit about the second component you were talking about in terms of running Métis or Indigenous people in general in what you call winnable ridings, and then you talked about the 25% threshold. Was there an analysis, do you think, of between 2016 and the previous election, 2011, I guess?
Yeah.
About changing demographics in those areas, and that might influence whether you run an Indigenous candidate or not, because perhaps the areas become more Indigenous. But did that enter into it at all?
Yeah, I think what compare with the two elections, like thinking of the most recent provincial election, 2019, which should have been in 2020, but the 2019 provincial election and the 2016 election is there was a lot of uncertainty on how that campaign would develop in 2016. Remember, the NDP were in real trouble. Selinger had been in government for a long time. The provincial electorate was tired of the NDP. The Selinger had the Gang of Five that revolted in his caucus, many of whom were cabinet ministers. So it looked like the governing party, the NDP at the time, was on the way out. The PCs under Brian Pallister, his first election ever as their leader, was looking very strong. But at the same time, the Liberals, the big question is, what would the Liberals do in Winnipeg and parts of Manitoba? So there were people who were actually thinking of running for the Liberals, thinking, well, I've got a shot at winning a seat in the Assembly, similar to what happened with the Sharon Carstairs election in 1988, in which there were people all across the province who were being elected in areas that had never seen Liberals or hadn't for decades seen Liberals. One of them is my neighborhood of Transcona. So I would say the big difference between the 2016 and the 2019 election wasn't so much the demographic changes in Manitoba, though there were some, but I think it was because of the uncertainty of your chances of running in any of those three parties in many parts of Manitoba. The Liberals, after all, the Liberals elected somebody in Coutts up in what was considered one of the safest ridings for the NDP up in the north, up in the Churchill area. The Liberals got elected in that area. So in this election, I mean, there was kind of a snapping back to the more traditional lines of, where will parties gain seats and where will parties lose seats? And there was much more up for grabs. But as you know, Rana Bakari in 2016 ran a very poor campaign. The Liberals didn't have money. it was like a train wreck. And so we didn't have that this time around. With regard to the demographics of Manitoba, I would say, like the north end of Winnipeg, the core areas, places where Nahanni Fontaine is elected, where Kevin Chief was elected before, his constituency office on Selkirk Avenue. I think there's a stronger chance for Indigenous candidates to get elected in parts of Manitoba, especially urban parts of Winnipeg, because there is more of a critical mass of people in certain areas. I would say also that the geographic pattern of Manitoba continues to be the same. That is, Winnipeg, the north half tends to be lower income, the south half higher income. Across the Canadian Shield, that diagonal line that cuts through Gimli and places like that. If you go above that line, that's NDP territory. Below that line, outside of Winnipeg, is Progressive Conservative. Those sorts of lines continue to be the pattern. I would say, politically speaking, in Winnipeg, there's been one shift that I've seen federally and provincially. Instead of the north-south division of the city, separated by downtown, we now have more of a donut, which is the donut is the suburbs and the core area, the very core area, the lower income folks mostly. So we've become more of a donut, similar to many places in the United States and other parts of Canada, where progressive conservatives get more support the more you go out to the burbs, and the NDP gets more support the closer you get to the Portage and Main.
Well, that was a comment I was going to make about 2016. In 2019, that the Tories have just done so much better in these outlying areas. Yeah. And I always think about, like, when they talk about Toronto and the the Belt, and all that sort of stuff.
905 Beltway.
Yeah, exactly. And that the NDP are more into the center of the donut, as you call it. That's kind of interesting. As our suburbs grow, do you see that the PC vote in those suburbs is going to expand accordingly, or?
Yeah, and that's federally as well. Jacques Marcoux, I don't know if you know Jacques Marcoux, who just left the CBC for another career, but he was their data analyst. And after each election, the last couple of elections, federally and provincially, he would put out these digital maps, and the digital maps not just took the ridings, but took the actual polling stations, and you could see the color blue for the Conservatives federally and the PCs provincially. That gets darker and darker as you get to that donut outside, and as you get to the inner parts of the city, it becomes light blue. And same thing for the Liberals federally. If you look at the last two elections, as you move outwards, you tend to get more Conservative Party of Canada support, and the Liberals are stronger both provincially and federally in places like River Heights, what have you. So the NDP, in many ways, provincially, they draw federal Liberal support when they're running provincially, and so the coloring of the map is a little bit different, more orange and blue rather than red and blue when you look at elections here.
Yeah. So
one other thing I should just mention, Bob, is one thing I always look at, and I don't really deal with it in this chapter in this article in Prairie History, but I always look at women voters when I look at Manitoba politics and federal politics in Manitoba, especially in the urban areas. And the Liberals tend to get more support from the women, and the Conservatives get more support from the men. And that's a pattern we've seen for a long, long time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Would you say that's almost in general across Canada, that sort of center-left parties appeal more to women than center-right parties to appeal more to men?
It's more of like a slight tendency rather than an outright strong pattern. But for many years, we've seen across Canada that the women voters tend to be a little bit more social community oriented, and men tend to be more sort of the hard economic, crime, those sorts of issues. So it's more of a propensity. And when we look at the 2016 election, and there's a great photo that Prairie History has of Pallister winning and the glitter, of the election night. And that was from the Free Press, and they were very kind to share that photo done by Mike Deal. The campaign advertisements that were done by the Progressive Conservatives leading up to that 2016 successful election for the PCs in many ways had women featured in those advertisements, and they were standing in front of hospitals and schools, so symbols of our community. And Pallister and his campaign director, David McLaughlin, were very effective in trying to win those people who used to vote for Selinger and Gary Doer, those women in the suburbs, to attract them over to the PCs. And they were very successful in the 2016 election, not so successful in 2019, but some success there.
Yeah. I was going to mention before, jokingly, about I had a collection for years of provincial NDP signs that I would stick on my lawn in River Heights, and store them in the garage after the election. And eventually I threw them all out, which was sad, because I thought maybe they'd be worth something on eBay. There were quite a number of them. But without going on too long about this, as I said before, I sort of am intrigued by, and like I said, you and I have talked about this a bit, the future of polling, how it's done, how accurate it is, that sort of thing. Well, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's been a lot of criticism of polling, especially since the 2020 US election. I have to say, I used the polling data. I looked at every state. I was in a pool of about 20 political scientists, and I came in second. And I did my predictions based on the polling data almost completely. Where there was a toss-up, I kind of said, which way is the wind going for the state? So there's a lot of kind of finger in the wind type work. But I would say the polling, where it had troubles this US election, was underestimating Donald Trump. And that was by 5 or 6%. That's a lot. 6 points. To be out 6 points in predicting your Republican support, that's beyond the so-called classical margin of error. So the polls were a failure with regard to Donald Trump, and saw too much of Biden's support, like just took it for granted that Biden was supported by Americans. At the same time, in Canada, the polling, and I've looked at this quite in depth. I've got a database, shows you how exciting my life is. I've got a database going back to 2015 where I've taken all the polls done in the last 5 days of each general election, all the federal elections since 2015, all the provincial general elections, and in total I have 69 polls that were done, released in the final 5 days of each campaign. Because as you know, a poll is only as good as close as it gets to the election day. Having a poll from 5 weeks prior, a lot of things can happen in that period. So generally speaking, our Canadian polling has been quite good. The last Alberta election was a fiasco.
Right.
They badly called the Alberta. They knew the Alberta Unity Party, or whatever it's called, Jason Kenney's party, they knew it would win, but they really were a lot out. Nick Nanos, I think, was out 10 points, and Nick Nanos is one of the best pollsters in the country. But for the federal elections, the almost all the polls are within like 2 points of predicting how the Liberal Party would do in 2019. And almost all the polls were within, like, on average, I should say, the difference between the polls and predicting the Liberal vote in 2015 was 2 points or 2.1 points. So I would say that we are doing pretty good in Canada with our polling. And we have to remember that polling is not the live interviewing that we used to have years ago. Of all those 69 polls I mentioned, only one company did 100% live telephone interviewing for their polling, and that was Nick Nanos. All the other polls, so that was 3 of his polls out of my 69 were 100% live interviewing. All those other polls are done either by IVR, interactive voice response, which are short and dirty, automated calls where you punch your number and your phone is to, you're voting liberal or conservative, what have you. And the other polls are mixed with online polling. That is, you have a panel of maybe millions of Canadians or hundreds of thousands of Canadians, and you pull a representative sample from that pre-recruited panel of online people, and then you survey them, and then you adjust to make sure they reflect the Canadian population. So the days of the random telephone live interviewer into your phone during a campaign, almost all of that's gone now, and it's almost all automated, and it's more weighted towards the demographics of our society.
So yeah, so this is a way that polling is dealing with the changing technologies, people with cell phones, people not wanting to engage live with someone on the phone about who they're voting for, because they maybe think that's, you know, their business kind of thing. But maybe in your thing about pushing a button, you know, gives them a certain anonymity, perhaps, in doing that. So that's the ways you see that they're adjusting to sort of changing times in terms of polling accuracy.
Yeah, you know, companies like Ipsos during elections, they do some live interviewing, but they also do online polling. And they take the two databases and they put them together. And they make, I'm sure they're making adjustments if one is wonky compared to the other. And so they have a way of internally checking that they aren't doing some rogue polling. The cell phones, you know, people now, you can't do a poll without including cell phones in your sample. And in the United States, you can't phone a cell phone for a survey unless it's a live interviewing doing the dialing. You can't do automated dialing for cell phone interviewing. So there are a lot of things that we can do in Canada that you can't do in the United States. But I would say, if anybody's interested, I did this piece for the Canadian Political Science Association. If you Google my name plus CPSA plus polling, you'll probably find the paper I presented 2 years ago at the Canadian Political Science Association. And I've updated that polling data for the World Association meeting that we had just in last month.
Great. Well, that's terrific. Thank you, Chris, for that. I think it's a great article. What I really, really, of course, like the article, as I've told you. What I like also is that we did, Prairie History did an article on something as recent as 2016. I think that's great. I'd love to see more that sort of thing. Anyway, thank you for doing this today. Thank you for the article. It was great, and I hope you contribute more in the future.
Great, thanks, Bob, and thanks to the Manitoba Historical Society for putting out this magazine. I think it's great. It goes prairie wide, and it's got prairie articles, and I look forward to seeing more issues down the pipe.
Yeah, and if you know, if your colleagues in Saskatchewan and Alberta who want to contribute, you can tell them we would love to hear from them. So
good. I'll spread the word.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.